I'm Vincent Lafargue. A few years ago, my life was a whirlwind. I was 25 years old and lived in a constant race against time, as if the clock itself were my greatest enemy. During the day, I taught French at a high school. At night, I played the role of a radio host, and in the gaps between commitments, I dedicated myself to theater. My calendar was a jumble of overlapping schedules, and my only goal seemed to be to fill every second with something productive. There was no time for breaks, for reflections, much less for spirituality. I considered myself Catholic. The only thing that really mattered was speed. The feeling that I was always heading somewhere, never stopping. I clearly remember that night when everything changed. I was returning home after a long day of work, riding my motorcycle through the streets of Geneva. The cold dawn wind cut against my skin, and my mind was still processing the commitments for the next day. That's when something strange happened. While waiting at a red light, I noticed that I had been repeating a word with a terrifying frequency in recent months. Fast. Everything had to be fast. My breakfast, my classes, my conversations, my commutes, even my scarce sentences were rushed, almost automatic. In that moment, without much thought, I did something I had never done before. I challenged God out loud. I whispered inside my closed helmet, "If you really exist, make me stop." The silence that followed was different from any I had ever experienced. A silence that seemed to breathe, as if something or someone were listening to me. It was then that I heard the voice. The voice was unlike any I had known. It was not my conscience, nor a stray thought in my mind. It was something external to me, yet at the same time close, intimate, soft but firm, full of infinite patience. "Do you really understand what you're asking for?" it asked. My heart jumped in my chest, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned my head from side to side as if expecting to find someone beside me, but I was alone. The traffic light was still red. The motorcycle's engine hummed softly under my hands, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. I swallowed. Did I really understand what I had asked for? I wanted to stop, but how far would that take me? Even with a lump in my throat, I quietly answered almost instinctively, "Yes." The traffic light turned green. I accelerated and moved forward. I had no idea those would be the last words I would utter before the impact. Just a few meters later, as I was traveling at about 50 mph, a shadow appeared in front of me. A car, out of nowhere, as if it had materialized in the middle of the road. There was no time to react. The stretch of road I was on was notorious for causing an optical illusion, hiding vehicles from one another. My brain didn't even have the chance to process what was happening. The crash was brutal. The world became a blur of lights and pain. A deafening roar filled my ears, and in an instant, I felt my body being hurled through the air. The force of the collision ripped me from the motorcycle, and for a second that felt eternal, I floated in the void. There was no control. I no longer existed. Time stood still. Then the asphalt welcomed me brutally, and everything went dark. The darkness was not just the absence of light. It was an absolute void, yet it did not feel terrifying. It was as if I had been torn from the world and placed somewhere where time and space no longer made sense. At first, there was nothing but that deep and infinite silence. I felt neither my body nor pain, nor cold, nor heat. Just the purest awareness that I existed, but in a different way. It was then that something changed. Small figures began to appear around me as if my brain were trying to reconstruct reality. Gradually distant sounds, indistinct voices, a strong smell of iron, blood. My vision was a blurry field of flashing red and blue lights. I was observing the scene from above. It took me a moment to understand what I was seeing. Below, a group of people were running back and forth, and in the middle of them, a body sprawled on the asphalt. Someone tried to cover it, others moved away with expressions of horror. It was then that I realized that body was me. The impact was immediate. How was this possible? I was watching myself, but I felt no connection to that wounded man. The blood flowed across the asphalt in dark little streams, reflecting the city lights. The driver of the car was nearby, pale, with her hands over her face, as if trying to block the scene from her eye. All of this was happening, and yet I felt a strange peace, an absolute neutrality. There was no fear or pain, just the realization that I was no longer that body. As I observed the scene from above, a strange sensation overtook me. I should have been in panic. I should have felt despair at seeing my own bloodied body on the ground. But that wasn't how it felt. There was an unbreakable peace, a serenity I had never experienced in life. Time seemed different there, as if everything happened at a smoother pace, free from the rigidity of hours and seconds. I could notice every detail, the reflection of the headlight on the wet asphalt under the fine drizzle, the driver's lips trembling in shock, the hurried gestures of the police officer who had arrived before the ambulance. I knew I should be dead, but I didn't feel dead. I simply was. It was then that I heard a constant, mechanical sound, something that contrasted with the tranquility of that state, a repetitive, almost annoying frequency. A beep, beep, beep. Gradually, I began to identify the source. It came from a heart monitor, and in that moment I understood something terrifying. I was in the hospital, but how? My perception adjusted, and suddenly, I was no longer hovering above the asphalt. Now I was, high above a cold, white room filled with medical equipment. My body lay there, stretched out on a stretcher, connected to wires and tubes, while doctors and nurses moved quickly around. They spoke in an urgent tone, but their words were muffled, as if I were hearing them underwater. Then, the sound of the monitor changed. The beep became a continuous, steady sound. A straight line appeared on the screen. That was my heart. It had stopped. In that moment, something happened. A pull not in the body, but in my very essence, as if an invisible force were drawing me beyond that hospital, beyond the world I knew. I was enveloped by a sensation that was hard to describe. It was neither fear nor pain nor joy. It was a calling. And then I saw a light, but it wasn't an ordinary light. It wasn't like the sun or any other illumination I had ever seen. It was an absolute, intense light that somehow didn't burn. It filled everything. It radiated a living presence, a warmth that didn't scorch but embraced. And it was in that moment that I realized this light wasn't just light. It was someone. I didn't need explanations. I knew what was before me, or rather, who it was. It wasn't just any presence. It was pure love, but not a human love conditional, full of flaws and limitations. It was something more, something greater. I felt that this light knew me deeply, more than I knew myself. It was as if every part of me was laid bare there without judgment, without condemnation, just welcome. For the first time in my life, I felt complete. There was no hurry, no urgency, just a feeling of absolute belonging, a silent yet clear invitation. I could go further, cross that threshold and immerse myself in what was calling me. But deep down, I also knew that it wasn't the time yet. The light seemed to envelop me entirely, and for a moment, I felt as if the weight of my existence had been dissolved. All worries, regrets, fears. I was facing something that transcends any human concept. Something that words could never precisely describe. But the most astonishing thing was when I realized that this presence, this light, not only knew me deeply, but also loved me unconditionally. It was a love that demanded nothing, that didn't ask for justifications, that didn't care about the mistakes I made. It was a love that simply was. I wanted to stay there, but then, as if something was pulling me back, I felt a subtle change. Almost imperceptible at first, the light was still there, but I began to feel a contrast, a reminder that something was still unfinished. I started to recall my life, not as a movie playing before my eyes, but as a silent call. I knew that if I wanted to, I could move on and fully cross that threshold. But at the same time, I felt that I hadn't finished what I needed to do. It was as if my journey was not yet complete, and in that instant, without a word being said, I knew I needed to return. But returning meant leaving behind that peace, that fullness. It was a difficult decision. But somehow, I knew it wasn't really my choice. It was as if something greater had already decided for me. The moment I realized I would return felt like a sudden break in that sense of fullness. Until then, I had no doubt that this was where I belonged. But suddenly, a different perception overwhelmed me. I still hadn't completed something essential in my existence. There were no words, no audible commands, but the certainty was absolute. The light that had once welcomed me so warmly now seemed to stay there just to ensure I wasn't being rejected. I simply didn't yet belong to it. A part of me wanted to resist. I wanted to plead to stay. I wanted to argue that I had never felt something so real before. But the love from that presence was so profound that there was no negotiation needed, because there was no need to discuss. It was at that moment when I felt a force pulling me back. The lightness that had accompanied me until then began to dissipate, and a new sensation emerged. It was as if I were being sucked back into an invisible whirlpool, returning to a space that felt too tight, too limited. I tried to resist. My spirit was returning to the body, and as this happened, I began to feel something that hadn't existed there before. Pain. An overwhelming, cutting pain, as if every nerve in my body were being reactivated at once. The absolute silence was replaced by agitated voices, the sounds of machines, and a sound I would never forget. The scream of a doctor exclaiming, "He's back!" My eyes suddenly opened, but all I could see were blurred lights and moving shadows. My chest was rising and falling uncontrollably, and my throat felt like it was on fire. I had returned, but I was no longer the same. The return was brutal. The peace I had experienced evaporated in an instant, replaced by a crushing weight. My body felt like a narrow, rigid prison, full of limitation. Every cell ached, as if it had been forcibly pulled back from death. The pain was not just physical. It was something deeper, as if my spirit was resisting being there again. The air burned my lungs with every breath, and my heart beat irregularly, as if it still wasn't sure if it wanted to keep functioning. Amid that chaos, I heard voices around me. Doctors and nurses rushed to stabilize my condition, and there was an atmosphere of disbelief in the air. One of them held my pulse, as if trying to confirm that this was real. "He was dead," someone murmured, almost like a confession. But I came back. In the days that followed, my recovery was slow and exhausting. My body felt like a burden I no longer recognized as mine. Every movement hurt, and every thought seemed out of place, as if I were caught between two worlds. The hospital became my temporary new home, and I started to be observed as a phenomenon. Doctors visited me with expressions of curiosity and perplexity, as if trying to understand what had happened. But the truth is that I didn't even know how to explain it myself. I didn't want to tell anyone about the light, about the love I felt, about the certainty that I had faced something infinitely greater. How do you explain that without seeming crazy? How do you put into words something that even my own mind couldn't fully process? Still inside me, Something screamed that it had been real. More real than anything I had experienced before. However, my mind could no longer function the same way it once had. The experience had left a mark on me, something I couldn't ignore. In the early days in the hospital, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a delusion caused by trauma, a hallucination brought on by pain and medication. But that explanation soon began to crumble. I could forget many things about the accident, the impact, what happened before the collision. But I couldn't forget the light. I couldn't forget that presence that seemed to have completely stripped me bare and, at the same time, loved me unconditionally. More than that, I could no longer fear death. It was as if something inside me had unraveled. And in its place, there was only an absolute certainty. Life didn't end there. And I could no longer continue living the same way. The following days brought an unexpected visitor, the hospital chaplain. I was never hostile towards religious people, but I also didn't care enough to listen to what they had to say. I always considered faith as something distant, almost out of style, something that didn't fit with my busy, pragmatic life. But that man insisted on visiting me, even when I politely rejected him. At first, I saw him as just another person trying to convince me of something. However, over time I realized he wasn't there to preach. He was simply there, listening, speaking little, but saying all the right things. It was he who helped me understand something I had yet to fully process. God didn't make me suffer. He didn't cause my accident. He simply accompanied me through the pain. He was with me when my body broke on the asphalt, and embraced me at the most crucial moment of my existence. And in that instant, I realized that I wasn't just coming back to life. I was being called to something greater. As the weeks went by and my recovery progressed, something within me continued to transform. Before the accident, my life revolved around speed, ambition, and the need to fill every second with something. Now there was a different kind of silence inside me. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of understanding. The experience I had wasn't just a glimpse of what lay beyond. It was a calling. I knew it, but I still didn't know what to do with that certainty. I could simply move on, try to return to the life I knew, resume my frantic pace, and pretend nothing had happened. But every time I thought about that possibility, it felt like I was ignoring something essential, as if I was rejecting a gift that had been given to me. So I did what I had never done before. I began to seek answers. I spent months immersing myself in different religions and philosophies, trying to understand what I had lived through. I read about near-death experiences, about stories of people who had felt something similar. But nothing seemed to truly capture the depth of what I felt. The light I saw wasn't just a philosophical concept. It wasn't a trick of the mind. It was someone, and that someone knew me better than I knew myself. During that search, 2 moments marked my decision. The first was a speech by the Dalai Lama, who spoke about the importance of rediscovering one's own faith, the tradition into which we were born. I, who had always shunned spirituality, felt that message was meant for me. The second moment was when I heard a radio announcer whose voice and words resonated within me in an inexplicable way. Discovering that this man was a priest was a shock, and at that moment I knew I needed to take a step forward. The decision to attend a seminary wasn't something I had planned ahead. It was almost like an instinct, a step I needed to take even without fully understanding where it would lead me. When I arrived there, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if I already knew deep down that this was where I was meant to be. But the biggest surprise came when I met the chaplain who had visited me in the hospital. He greeted me with a calm smile, as if he had been expecting me. And in that moment I understood something that had once seemed impossible. My life had a new purpose. I, who had spent so long running from any spiritual commitment, was now there, ready to immerse myself in what had once felt like a distant reality. The training was intense and challenging, but with every step I felt I was on the right path. The light that embraced me at the moment of my death didn't disappear from my life. It simply showed me a new path to follow. Years later now, ordained as a priest, I returned to the hospital where it all began, this time not as a patient, but as a chaplain. The same man who had been by my side, who had listened to me without haste and without judgment, was now passing me the baton. The cycle was closing in a way I could never have predicted. When I entered the hospital that morning, I saw patients in the hallways. I saw tired faces, trembling hands clutching sheets, and I felt a weight that I would not have been able to bear before. But above all, I felt the same presence that had embraced me at the moment of my accident, and I realized that my mission was simple: to be there to accompany, to offer listening, presence, and hope. I, who had asked God to make me stop, now understood that He hadn't stopped me. He simply put me on the right path, and I never looked back. If this story impacted you, imagine how many others are out there waiting to be told. Have you ever gone through something that completely changed your perspective on life? Have you ever had an experience that made you question everything? Share it here in the comments. We want to hear your story. And don't forget, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more content like this. Stories that transform, challenge, and make us see life differently. This helps the channel continue bringing amazing stories to you. Now, if you want to see another incredible near-death experience, click on the video that appears on the screen. You'll get goosebumps. See you in the next video. Until then,